Welcome to episode 23 of the Lilylist podcast, where our goal is to be a handbook for the living. We're thrilled to be joined by JV Hilliard, a best-selling author known for his epic and dark fantasy novels, including the Warminster Saga. From his early inspirations, shaped by family and Dungeons and Dragons, to navigating the complexities of the publishing world, JV shares his creative journey, insights on storytelling, and thoughts on leaving a lasting legacy. Whether you're a fantasy enthusiast, a writer, or simply someone fascinated by the art of moving from government to creative endeavors, this episode has something for you. As always, visit lilylist.com for more information on the podcast and platform. You can also contact us from the website if you have questions or ideas for people or topics you'd like to see us cover in the future. If you'd like to support the work of Lilylist, you can donate using the links in the description, and if you find these conversations meaningful, we thank you for liking, following, sharing, or subscribing wherever you listen. Joe Hilliard, thank you for joining the Lilylist podcast. Glad to have you here.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Here at Lilylist, I'm always curious to understand where you came from. So pre-high school, where'd you grow up? What was childhood like? And was there anything that was impactful to you before the age of about 15, 16?
Yeah, sure. So I'm originally from Pittsburgh. My wife and I live here now as well, but that wasn't always the case. And like you said, I grew up kind of in a blue collar family. My father was a steel worker and my mother was a homemaker, but turned into a nurse as my uncle was paralyzed. He was a Marine and he was in combat, was paralyzed in combat. So when I grew up by his bedside, and there were very few things that he could do as a quadriplegic. And although technology's gotten better over the years, at the time, he was pretty limited. And when I was really young, he was in a wheelchair. But as I grew up, he was bedridden before he passed away. And as part of that, I grew up at his bedside watching him be a writer. He was able to type, and they created an implement that allowed him to click on a keyboard. And at the time, what was popular was horror novels and short stories and pulp fiction and things like that. And so I emulated him. I wanted to be him as I grew up, and he was a second father to me. I saw him more than I saw my dad, because my dad would work all these crazy swing shifts and things just to make money. But we were a really close-knit family. And then there was a convergence of a few things that happened right around the fourth or fifth grade. I was turning 10 years old, and my English teacher went out on a medical sabbatical. And the last month or so of the school district or the school year, our substitute teacher somehow, some way got permission, as our English was, to read us The Hobbit. And I absolutely fell in love with fantasy adventure as a result of that. And I asked my uncle if he could get me a box set of Dungeons and Dragons to start. Now I was 10 years old, and I was a little early to start, but I was always a good writer, and I was always very imaginative, a good storyteller. And part of that came from him. Like, I watched him write stories and put them in the magazines and things like that, and sometimes not be successful. But the Dungeons and Dragons thing, the serendipity in that was, it was escapism for him. It was something he could do. He could play that game. And as a result, there were lessons, and both life lessons and teaching lessons that happen as part of that, especially when you're playing a different character that's not you, and you're doing things in a different way, and you experience stuff that are challenges, some of them physical in the game, others are more mental, right? And so I think the convergence of my love for fantasy adventure, coupled with his condition and his willingness to tutor me throughout that game and to teach me how to write, was something I always wanted to do. But life got in the way, right? And at part, my uncle passed when I was literally my first year in college. And with that went a little the desire to do that. Like, I lost that kindred spirit as part of it. So I went on the shelf, and I meandered into doing defense lobbying. It was a way for me to write. I wrote every day, whether it was a speech or public policy or a grant or contract or even things for my clients. But it was always not the same. It didn't feel right. Right. And then when COVID happened, DC was shut down for like 2 years almost, and there was nothing to do. So my wife wagged her finger at me. She's like, "You're going to drive me nuts. You're too high energy. Go something." And I revitalized the idea of writing what I thought was going to be a standalone fantasy adventure novel that's turned into a series now. So, I mean, that's how I got started. And you asked about a seminal moment, and I think a lot of it came together with that reading of Lord of the Rings and, of course, my uncle's condition, I pulled everything together and set me on a path. Even though I didn't take it right away, I returned to it.
Did you, so when you mentioned growing up in Pittsburgh, were you in the city? Were you homebody? Did you have other kids around that shared a similar interest, or were you good at time boxing your time from an early age?
I think it's a bit of all of those, right? So I, like you, grew up in a poor family. My father was laid off for much of his career that I remember. And so we did the unemployment thing and we got the government cheese and all those kind of fun things. But the one thing he was able to accomplish is he did get us out of the projects. We went to a poorer area of the city known as Carrick, and then eventually into Baldwin, which was a very, if you roll out of bed the wrong way, you're out of the city, but you're in Baldwin. You're that close to the city. Like if I could walk to the city if I wanted to. And so even though we were a quote unquote suburb, we were really close to the city. So a lot of our family still lived there. A lot of our friends were there. But to the other point of your question, I did have a lot of friends. My wife teases me about how we're still like the kids from Goonies in the sense that we grew up all nerds and we loved this kind of stuff. We somehow found each other in middle school. And to this day, on Sunday nights, in fact, tonight, 6 to 10, we play Dungeons and Dragons together. And we're all across the country now. We're all in various stages with our families and kids and things like that. So we don't play as often as we once did, but we play once a week. Every now and then we have to miss something because someone's away or the dungeon master can't play. But for the most part, it's a pretty steady once a week, 4-hour thing. And it was because of that. And I think that as goofy as this is going to sound, playing Dungeons and Dragons is a lot like playing a team sport. Instead of you making friends on your travel baseball team, you make friends with people that you've gone to war with, although it's fake. It's a delusion that you created, a group delusion in your head where things are happening to you and your friends, and it's not really happening, but to you, it does, especially when you're younger and your imaginations are running wild. And you talk about it all the time and you strategize at study hall and you try to get back at the dungeon master for doing the things you don't want them to do and ruin their adventures. And they're trying to stop you from ruining their adventures. And it's a lot of fun. So for us, even though it may not have been sports, that was our team. And there was always a group of 6 solid players that were around and another group of 6 that floated in and out on varying times. Some of us graduated before others graduated after. Sometimes when you finally got your first job, you couldn't play as much as you once did and things like that. But the core group of about a dozen of us continue to play. And today, all of us are still part of that group in some way, shape, or form. There's a few that don't play as much. Kids get in the way, family stuff, jobs often, but they float back in and out when schedules change and things open up, because it's just like having a chance to do that. And we're not limited by our physical limitations with age anymore. So I don't have to worry about getting hurt on a softball field or a hockey rink. Instead, I just get out my 20 side and roll and have a fun time. And all of my battles are done mentally through the role playing that we do. So for me, it was a bit of both. It was growing up around a group of kids that liked the same kind of stuff. That finding each other was important. And then ultimately we've stayed together as lifelong friends as a result.
Cool. So I was never much of a D&D player, but I had friends and family who were, and I've played a couple of times, but I took much more to the horror genre than the fantasy genre. And so I know that there's a dungeon master, and I'm wondering, as you mentioned your uncle passing and how that impacted you with regard to continuing with writing, which we know you got back to. But I'm wondering, through high school, college, did you study writing? Were you the dungeon master? Were you always telling stories?
Yeah. So for me, I was one of a dungeon masters that, for those who've never played the game, the dungeon master, as you mentioned, is basically the storyteller. You are the one that creates the story through which the player characters, PCs, are playing. And over the years, I became the steady dungeon master, for lack of a better term. Instead of a steady quarterback in a football tag game, I was a steady dungeon master. I think a lot of my friends enjoyed the storytelling. I enjoyed it. And I enjoyed sort of the control over the game and making it fun for everybody else. Nowadays, we take turns at it. Right now, I'm a player in the game, but I've always enjoyed it. And I think that's really helped me in my storytelling, which while the game is a lot of verbal stories where you're trying to tell someone a story and they're listening to you and they're hanging on your every word. Now you've got to change that into something that someone's going to read. Right. And so you have to be a good writer. And even though I did take a lot of writing and communication classes, they were important to political science and frankly, some of the economic stuff that I was involved in. Ultimately, I got the practice of writing every day, right? My clients demanded it. The ownership of my business demanded it. And so you just became good at it. Now, there's a big difference between writing nonfiction and fiction. Like you don't have to pace nonfiction. You don't have to have character arcs in nonfiction, but you do have to make an argument. You have to make a story. And so even though I could compel somebody to do something and vote for something or take action on something based on what I'm writing, I call to action in the non-fiction side, those same principles still exist on the fiction side. But I like you too. I like horror stuff. Like for me, I can't wait to write the American Vampire novel. Like it's in me. I know it. I have the story, but I also make my fantasy a little bit more dark. There is a genre fantasy called dark fantasy where the good guys don't always win. And I have a tendency to spin up some of the gothic into my novels because I enjoy that. And I think that things that scare you and therefore would scare the characters of my book or scare the characters in my Dungeons and Dragons campaign are going to be of interest. And sometimes they can be a dragon. Other times they can be other magical creatures or gods that you'd recognize and things like that. But for me, I've always had a fun time making something where there's undead involved, right? So like in D&D, there's a very famous run of adventures called Ravenloft, where you're facing off against their version of Dracula, basically, and some of the stuff that they do. And I find a lot of fun in that, or some of those, because they're ground in some form of realism. And so people, whether they watch an exorcism movie or Freddy or whoever, Jason, they're still going to be scared. And you could take some of those aspects and drop it into your novel. And that's a little different than the Tolkien epic fantasy, where it's good versus evil and Sauron and they're untouchable. And it's this epic clash of them coming together. And even though you'll find that in my epic fantasy novels, my novels are both epic and dark. The good guys, if you read the Warminster Saga, you'll discover that not all the heroes come through it, right? And that's just true to form. And I think that that's been popularized recently over the last 10 years by Game of Thrones. And we've seen that too. And because Game of Thrones sort of led the way with your heroes not making it through the end of the book, in this case, even the end of the HBO series, you still fall in love with those characters. And you want to see how everything works out. So the bad guys win sometimes. The bad guys are smart too. And I also like the idea that bad guys aren't rooted in something that's just born evil, right? This isn't like the devil, Lucifer himself coming to get you. There are characters that have had a fall of some kind, very similar to Darth Vader, where, Darth was good and then he did something that we might have all done, to save people that we love, and it turned him bad. And then at the end, he had a redemption arc written for him where he could come back to the good side. Well, some of my villains have the same thing, right? Where some of them have these redemption arcs and they may choose to come back and they may choose not to come back, and not all do. And I think that helps also make for a good story and a dark fantasy story.
Well, so you mentioned COVID and that getting you into writing. I'm curious on the writing side, not just about I'd love to hear, I have a kind of pretty good picture at this point of where you came from and where some of your inspirations and things had come from. But from the business side, breaking into, I don't know, being an author and getting published, what's that journey look like?
Yeah, I knew nobody. It was one of those things that's awkward for me because as a lobbyist, you subsist on your network. Yeah. And you would think that someone somewhere in my network would have done something similar. And the truth is no. And when I told people I was writing novels, they assumed it was going to be some sort of fiction, history thing, or maybe even historical fiction at best, baking into it politics. And here I am coming at this thing from this big epic fantasy, dark fantasy thing. And they couldn't get their heads around that. So what I did was I wrote it for the sake of eating up time. And then I sent it to a friend of mine who was an associate professor at a local community college here in Pittsburgh. And she read it and said, you know what, you've got something that's publishable here. I don't know your genre very well, but outside of the fact that it's a little long and it needs some pacing and there's some stuff in here that you need to learn, you should go out and get a development editor, somebody that can help you take a look at what you're writing. And I said, great, what's a development editor and where do they find them? Right. Yeah. And what it turns out to be is there's multiple levels of editing that goes on to any kind of manuscript. And I was learning this on the fly, right? So the first step is to find someone that looks at the story, reads it for what it is, and then pokes holes in the story that you're too close as the author to see. So they're looking for plot holes, they're looking for character flaws, they're looking for things you're missing, and or they'll suggest to you things that might be better stories for you, or that will enhance your story as part of that. And you take that advice and you go back and tweak everything, and you come back with something that's a second or third run of a draft of a manuscript that eventually goes on to someone called a copy line editor. And that copy line editor they're looking for grammar. They're looking for punctuation and spacing and all those other kind of things. And then it goes on to a final editor, and then it goes on to beta reading, and you send it out to people that are familiar with your genre and all that kind of stuff. None of which I knew. None at all. But my development editor, very much like my friend who told me to go find somebody on Upwork. And I did. I found a great guy, Dane Cobain, who is in the UK. He had written some stuff tangentially about fantasy and sci-fi. So I was interested in him, and he was the right price. And I felt comfortable working with him. And at the end of the journey, he said, you've got something real here. And all first-time authors, I don't care who they are, they suffer from imposter syndrome. You're like, is this really publishable? And what you find out is the answer is yes. In most cases, if you've gotten through to finishing a book and with the direction of an editor, someone who's been there multiple times that can tell you this is what you got to tweak and how things happen. And he said at the end, he's like, look, I think you really have something that's publishable. I'm going to put you in touch with a publishing friend of mine, someone that used to work with him together at a previous publishing house. And when that publishing house went away, she broke off and did her own publishing house. He broke off and started doing his own editing, his own writing. And I got connected to my publisher. Now, that, from what I understand, is a very rare story. Excuse me. Usually it doesn't happen that way. Usually you're out there hunting for an agent, or you're sending 150 query letters to publishers with your asking them to take a look at your stuff. I got lucky. I got lucky because of a piece of advice that led to the right contact who thought my stuff was good enough, who passed me on to the right person. And voila, I got a book contract out of the gate. But under one circumstance, she said, usually fantasy novels are not standalone. So I want a series. And that series became 3 books that eventually became 4 books that now are much more than that. And as a result, I learned the ropes accidentally and through folks that kind of coached me, some of which was free advice, others of which you paid for. But it was something that doesn't necessarily come as easy as I found it. And I don't think that was because of any kind of skill. I mean, I think I have a strong story and people enjoy it. But, it also was a little serendipity. I was in the right place at the right time and got connected to the right people. And that's how I got to where I was. But now that I've been doing this for 4 or 5 years, I see the industry as it is, and it's a lot more difficult than my path was for most people. And or others they don't even want to be published. They publish on their own independently to control that. And there are those out there that have been incredibly successful doing that. As I think the biggest complaint you'll hear about our marketplace is that it's antiquated. There's, few points of entry, and there are gatekeepers all along that way. And it's tough to break into unless you have a lot of money and or you have a name. And I had neither. So for me, it was, I got in based on some merit and some right contacts. But, I think that those that have gone the independent publishing route and done it on their own on Amazon and other places can still be just as successful in this marketplace.
So that's really cool. I mean, I'm glad for you. I think sometimes we forget how much of a role that luck can play. It still requires hard work. It requires commitment. It requires all these things. So yeah, I think that's a great story. I'm curious where you are now. I'm making the assumption you're doing this kind of full time. You're not writing government contracts and things at this point. How has it been? It sounds like your wife was the one that kind of nudged you toward this.
Yeah. Well, I'll say this. Andrea has always been good for me in the strangest of ways, even though this was not necessarily her suggestion, but it's what I took from her suggestion. it's really played a big decision and a big part of how I play my back nine, right? Like I'm halfway through my career and I don't want to go back to do what I was doing. And part of it is politics is a rough sport, right? It's a contact sport and no one comes out clean. And you either get beat up because someone stole your client, or you lose your client because you didn't get them what you were going to chase for them, or you do everything right and it still doesn't work out that way and you make enemies. And it's a zero-sum game and it's not friendly. And this is entirely opposite. My first interview, and this is, and I say this often, so you might find this on other interviews I've given, is that my first interview, I studied for it for 2 days. I literally thought it was going to be like my political interviews where there was going to be gotcha moments. They were going to have someone on that was going to ask me questions about what they didn't like about my novels or anything like that. And that's what I'd lived through. It was my experience. My experience was press is bad, right? Like you're just going to get your head beat in. They're coming after you for a reason. They've got a story, they've got an angle, and they're coming after you. But I needed the exposure. So I'm reaching out to folks like you. And it hit me. All of it, it was like a train. If there was a moment of clarity or an epiphany, maybe is the better word for it, is when the interviewer asked me, what time of year, what season did I like to write in most? And I realized for a second, wait a minute, this guy's really trying to help me. And that doesn't exist in my previous, because if I helped you, it was either because it also benefited me or there was something I wanted to get back from it. Like I don't know what it is, but usually it's like you can't trust anybody. In here, authors help other authors, creatives help other creatives. It's a supportive community. And as I lurch toward, I'm nowhere near retirement age, but look, I spent the first 20 years doing something that I look back on and I'm like, well, I never, ever want to do that again, because here everyone is so supportive. You get writers, and even when they're constructively critiquing you, it's to help you. And in the beginning, you might not recognize that, but ultimately, when Andrea said to me, "Do something," I don't think she had this in mind, and because it was a complete 180 from what I was doing. But she's very supportive of it now, because from a mental health perspective, even a physical health perspective, I've got time now to do things I would have never done before. But you are right. You are on the road. And if you're selling books, you need to be contacting people. That's just the way it is, right? You got to go out, book signing. In my realm, it's a lot of conventions. So you go to a lot of nerd conventions like Comic-Con and GalaxyCon and all these other cons that are out there where you meet fellow geeks who want to buy your stuff because they enjoy the same thing you do, and they're target-rich environments. But doing the podcast stuff and radio and TV interviews and getting out in front of people at libraries and book clubs, that puts you on the road. And some of it you can do regionally. But if you want to become better, well-known in your genre, you've got to get on the road and hit some of these larger cities and hit some of those larger conventions. And so for me, I've always been traveling anyway, but that doesn't matter. I go to my clients, I go to DC, I have to go to an event somewhere. So being on the road is second nature, but this kind of being on the road is a lot more fun. It just is. And so, as I mentioned earlier, as I have a look toward the back nine and what I want to finish my career doing, this is just so much more inviting than what I was doing. Like eventually I was going to just break down and be like, I can't do it anymore. And here, this is something that I get to get up every day and write a story that someone will eventually buy and read. And that ain't bad. I'll take that 10 times and twice on Sunday, versus what I was doing before.
Okay. So that's maybe takes us to where we are today. And so I'm assuming you're writing most days. Where are you at right now with you mentioned you've got a number of stories that are around this story and character arc that you initially did. Where are you at now with that series? What are you working on? And I would say, what do you want to work on, not only from a storytelling perspective, but, what is it that you feel you do really well? And what are the things that you think you need to improve on?
Yeah. Let me start with the first question there. So right now, the Warminster Saga has finished. It's a quadrilogy. Fourth book came out in September, Echoes of Ghostwood. And it's epic fantasy meets dark fantasy series. And if you like that kind of stuff, if you're a fan of Game of Thrones or Lord of the Rings or Dungeons and Dragons, this will feel like home to you. The characters are similar. I've got my own races. I've got my own gods. I've got my own currency, my own form of magic, and things like that. Like all good authors do, you world build for yourself. But on the back end of that, next year, I'm going to release 3 standalone novels, 2 of which are going to be based on the more popular characters in the novels. So if you're a fan of Incanus Druwaith, the assassin, or you're a fan of Sir Ritter of Vulcaneer, you'll get to see their origin stories. And the last story is of Princess Adeline Elspeth. And the reason that comes out last is it's the bridge story to the next series that comes out in 2026. So I'll have another trilogy that's a follow-up from the Warminster Saga that will launch in 2026. And that coincides with 2 other things. One is I've licensed the intellectual property of the Warminster Saga to both a video game company and a graphic novel group. And those properties will also launch in 2026. So that year is going to be a big year for the property as a whole, the Warminster stuff as a whole. However, to the other questions that you have, yes, I do write every day, even if it's just outlining something or going back and editing something. You just have to stay in that practice. I think that's a big, big thing for writers who want to do this on a daily basis and do this as a career. You have to write something every day. But I think that what's easy for me is the story, right? Like in my head, I know what's going to happen. This is a great epic saga. I love writing it. I love the characters that are involved in it. I love the way it's fared itself out throughout the writing process and the direction that it's going. So for me, the thing I like to do most is to build out that world, continue to add nuance to it, continue to add nuance and history and future around all those characters, very similar to what's all done. And it is all encompassing. And like you said, there are those out there that are never going to read a 500-page novel with 150,000 words in it, but they might watch a video game, or they may read a graphic novel that narrows that down a little bit more, and it stays within the guardrails of the story, but also provides a medium that they're more familiar with, one maybe they're more comfortable with, right? So you get a lot of that. The other part is the part you ask about what I don't like. And I think any author that's being honest with you is going to say editing. Editing is the worst part of what you do. And in part, it's I sort of describe it as going to the dentist, right? Yeah. Nobody wants to go to the dentist ever for anything ever. The word dentist, you're like, but you go, and when you leave, your teeth are clean. You got a clean bill of health. You got another 6 months before you have to show back up. And you realize, all right, it's good. It's like getting an oil change, right? Like you're ready to rock and roll after that. And for me, editing is a lot like that for an author, but you get people poking holes at your story. You have to go rewrite stuff. It might take me 3 months to write a book, and it takes me the same amount of time to get through the editing process. But when it comes out on the other side, it's a much better product. It just is. It's seen the eyes of professional editors. It's seen the eyes of my publisher. It's seen the eyes of, really strong beta readers who are out there that get an advanced reader copy and tell you what they like and don't like. And they're super familiar with your genre. I tell people that all the time. Don't share your book with your mom and ask her what her opinion is, because it's always going to be the best story ever, right? That's what you need. You need someone who knows your genre and understands what you're writing and can compare it contemporarily to what's out there in the market today, currently, and tell you where it's falling down. And then you take that advice and fix it. And then when you send it out, even though it's a pain in the butt, at the end of the day, it's just a much better product. So what I need to do better is be more, even though I pride myself on it, it still hurts every time I do it. I have to be more open to constructive criticism. I have to learn from others that are looking into it. And you just have to grin and bear it and run the gauntlet. And on the other side, it's going to be a better product. And for that, be thankful. That's exactly what I say to other authors, is be open to constructive criticism, because nobody is. They say they are, or a lot of authors are just afraid to share their stuff because they don't want people criticizing it, or they think it's a reflection of their internal whatever. And you got to put your ego aside for that. You just got to say, look, it's not going to be for everybody. When your friends don't buy it, don't be upset. But they're not your target market. Your target market are the people that are going to buy it. They're going to show up at your book signing. They're going to show up at the convention. They're going to show up and want you to sign something, and they're going to come to you and tell you what they liked and didn't like. And please don't kill this character, or why did you do that? Like I had this woman just this past week finish book 4, and she emailed me and she's like, why didn't this certain person live? And I was like, well, keep in mind, it's fantasy, and not when you're dead, you're not really dead sometimes. Just ask Jon Snow, like that kind of stuff. You can make fun out of it, because you'd never know. But sometimes it makes for a better story. And that's why people die in the novels, or please don't kill this character. And meanwhile, you've already killed them. They just haven't read the next book yet. And you're like, oh, yeah. How do I reconcile that with a person that wants to buy the book who's standing in front of me? But those interactions are those that I cherish the most, because they care enough to pay money to come to see you. They traveled. They, some cases, have gotten a hotel room. They're going to buy your book, and they want to tell you what they think of your stuff. And you know that you've really affected someone's life in a way that makes, look, I know it's just entertainment, but at the end of the day, we always cherish those moments, those weekends, right? We don't care what we do on a Wednesday night. We care what we're doing on a Saturday night, right? That's a wasted weekend. We're never wasting a Wednesday evening. And I think that people that have traveled out there, some of which come in costume, that I've gotten fan art, I've gotten asks for folks to do fan fiction, things like that. I'm like, well, why don't we just do the first series before you do it? Fiction, that kind of stuff. But, that's the kind of stuff I enjoy the most. And that's also the kind of thing I dislike, and the place where I need to improve.
When you were talking too, I was thinking, so I started out in software development and then moved into product, and everything you were saying. On the software development side, we call editors QA people, and we have the same love-hate relationship with them. And then on the product side, as you said, Lily List as a product, yeah, people that are friends and family are going to tell you it's great and you're doing a wonderful thing, but it's getting it in front of those people that don't know who you are and saying, is this actually worthwhile? Are you going to spend your time on it? And that feedback is invaluable. But moving beyond that, I'm curious, what does, at this point in your life, you've still got quite a bit left, and barring something unforeseen, but what does legacy mean to you? And do you think about it much at this point in your life?
Well, yes and no. I think about it in the sense that what I'm creating, regardless of its level of commercial success, is something that's immortal. It's left, right? It's my own child, except this child exists in books. So you're creating characters, and you're creating something that 100 years from now, someone might want to read and enjoy. And it's something you can leave for them. I look at it in the same way a craftsman builds a home. That home might 20 people in it, 20 different families before its time has come and gone. And it's a legacy that you've left based on something you've done with your hands. In this case, it's something I've done with my mind and my hands, or at least my fingers, for typing. And you want to leave something that's a little bit about you. And not all of us are going to leave a historical mark, but ultimately it's something you can leave the people that are behind you. And so whether it's retirement and you ride off in a sunset with the family and your legacy, or your kids or your grandkids or your great grandkids, or all that kind of stuff, or it's something like this where you're leaving something that you've built and you've bled your heart and soul into, and you can leave it for someone else to enjoy long after you're gone. Like, you can't help not to think about those things. That's the fun part about it. There is some level of permanence that comes with that, where it will live on beyond me, and you hope that people enjoy it enough, and it's got enough traction where it could be bigger one day than it currently is. It's already grown. I mean, it went from just into my head into a one book. Now it's 4 books. Now it's a video game. Now it's going to be a graphic novel series. Who knows where it goes from there? So for me, I enjoy talking about it, because I think that there's something that's like super sexy about that, and the fact that I've got enough tread left on the tire, that I can really build on that and world build this. I'm not doing this at the end of life, right? This is something I'm doing in the middle of life. And I've got as many years as I want to write this. And if I wanted to go in a different genre, I could too. I know that some publishing houses don't like that, because you don't look for Stephen King in the romance section. You want to have that brand and be true to your brand. And I get that. From a business perspective, I absolutely get that. But there are stories that I can tell that I haven't told, like the horror novel that I talked about before. I've got this great idea that meshes Dracula with exorcism. And I think it's just an awesome, cool sort of vampire tale that's dark, really dark, and it's set in sort of like a contemporary US. That is hard to pitch to your publishers, because most publishers, they're single-minded. This is the books I publish. I like my publishing house is Dragon Moon Press. They don't publish much on vampires, right? They do Dragon Moon Press. That's exactly what you get. A lot of fantasy, little sci-fi, a little dystopian, but that's what they do. So I would have to go out there and find something else, but I've got time to do that. And for me, I would rather spend the time doing that than doing what I was doing before. And so there's this time where I bridged where that was making money for me while I was working toward the exit of doing this full time. And now that I'm sort of transitioning that way, eventually, as I get beyond my work in government in the past, that'll be a memory. And this is sort of like a second career. And I really enjoy doing that. And from a legacy perspective, I like the idea of something being eternal, something I can leave to people that someone might dust off 100 years from now and say, what a cool story, right? And continue to read it and want more.
Yeah. I hear some similar stuff. I talk with a number of artists regularly, and I'm curious though, from the personal standpoint on legacy, do you do anything? You do a lot of writing. Do you do any journaling? Are you capturing your journey and your lessons learned? Are you thinking about how you personally, beyond the storytelling? I mean, I guess it's all storytelling at the end of the day, right? Stories are kind of the true currency of life in a way. But if you think about from your wife and family members and people like that, I mean, are you capturing some of this journey in a way that can be left behind and touch generations that might come up after?
Yeah, it's a great question. I do a lot of work with memoirists, and so folks that are around me, I read and beta read their stuff all the time. And it's a thought that has occurred to me, and I is a little off track, but you'll if you follow me for 2 seconds, you'll see where it's going.
Yeah.
So I have obsessive compulsive disorder, and not the kind of OCD that people tease about because they think they have it. I'm talking about OCD, right?
Yeah.
And so for me, I obsess, and there's a compulsion around. I even in my writing, I'm such a plotter. Like I can't write without a plan. I need to know where I'm writing toward. Like you can't just say write. And those kind of writers can write by the seat of their pants. I can't do that. Like I have to think about what I'm writing. I outline it. I know where I'm going, and then I write it. Right. And so for me, all of my outlines, and frankly, all of my years of playing Dungeons and Dragons, I've memorialized in a way where I've kept at one time hard copies of character sheets and adventures and all this other kind of stuff that I had done, and memorialized those in a way. And now I'm doing it by digitizing it. I'm putting it on there, and I could share that with my friends, and I can leave that someone, even though those things didn't exist anywhere else except for in my head. I use those things to build my world. So you'll find 20 years of Dungeons and Dragons playing baked into my novels because the storylines came from gameplay. Right. And I think from that perspective, that would be great. And I can see myself doing a memoir when it's all said and done, something like that. I haven't gotten there. And I think in part because I'm halfway home. In my head, I've still got a lot of tread on the tire. So like, I don't know, like the minute you write that, it's like, okay, well, what comes next? And if there isn't next, then why isn't that included in what you wrote? And so the OCD in me is preventing me from doing it. But, ultimately, I think it would be really cool. And I appreciate the effort it takes. And a lot of folks do the memoir stuff because they've had an event in their life that people can learn from. I have a few of those too, right? We all do. And I think that there would be something that would be cool to be written. And I think it would also be something that you can leave, not as a legacy just to your family and friends, but also to a group of people that want to know the author behind the Warminster Saga and what it took and how he got there and how all these things came and connected. And I think that would be an interesting write as well. But right now, I can see that a little far out. Like I want to have enough to write about to put in there. But yes, I've given it some thought, and I think eventually I will. But right now, it's just in the internal memorialization I'm doing with the story writing as it goes, so people will have they can look back at the tracks that brought the train here.
Yeah. I think in a way, to use maybe your terminology a bit, I mean, each life is a saga, right? So when you think about memoir, when I think about memoir, I'll say is I think of that as you said, like you're older, you're looking back across the entire saga. But I also think there's value in capturing, we've all got eras of life, right? So, well, as someone who spent a lot of time in and around DC, the last question I'm going to dive into is we sort of live in this kind of legalistic society. So with your own IP and these business dealings and things, I'm assuming at this point you've got wills and medical proxies and all that sort of stuff in place. Is that a good assumption, or is that something
Yes.
from you? Yeah.
Yes. I mean, that's something I learned early on from the mistakes of others, not to leave to chance. So, yeah, my wife and I took care of that shortly after we got married.
Oh, cool. Yeah. It's something, as you said about the memoirs, there's still a lot of tread on the tires. I hear that from people when I ask that question. And I say it's not a problem if the wheel comes, I mean, it's still a challenge for people left behind if the wheel comes completely off. But if the wheel just gets a flat in it and you can't make decisions for yourself, you're putting a lot of pressure on those around you to take care of those things. So that's why I always ask that question.
It's a good one. It's a rightful one too. And I think people that haven't done it should. It doesn't take that much.
Yeah. Well, cool, man. Well, this was awesome. Oh, one question I wanted to ask quick, and this may or may not make it in, but I'm curious. All the work around AI that's being done, all the stuff that we see, are you finding any usefulness to it? It's funny. I thought last night, maybe because this interview is coming up, I was like, I want to ask ChatGPT to create a new language for me. And
So, yeah, the answer there is it's both a tool and an asset and also a curse.
yeah,
Right. So, in my business, as any business, what you find is, in particular for me, plagiarism is a bad thing.
yeah,
Right. And ChatGPT and other forms of AI are just that. They might not look it, but at the end, it just went out and scraped a bunch of words together that it doesn't know what it means,
yeah,
put them together that someone else wrote. And so ultimately, I even know that there's a reverse AI out there that's telling you that this X amount percent of what was written through AI. And they'll throw it through a AI generator and see if it was written by someone else. And so for me, it's a tool. And I think it can be a tool for things like outlining. I think it can be a tool for things like new ideas. But what comes from you and what eventually ends up being published has to be you.
yeah,
It has to be. And so I think that the problem, what we're going to find is, and we're seeing it now, you're seeing it with court challenges and homework at colleges, and people are getting thrown out. So that basically for plagiarizing someone else's work. And that's exactly, even though it saves you a ton of time. Like if you want to use it to put together a copy on your website, that's not hurting anybody. You're just borrowing language that someone else did. Sorry, I found inspiration over here. And that's great. And you could do that on your own if you wanted to. It just takes more time. But if you're writing a novel, I had one author who shall remain nameless, who said that they asked ChatGPT to write a novel in their own language, like in their own tone, like basically saying, write it the way I would write it. And he said that it came back and it was pretty good. He's like, yeah, that pretty much is exactly how I would write it. But the story was disjointed and everything. He had to go back and clean it up. So from that perspective, if you're doing it for yourself, all right, well, maybe that makes sense. But the minute I say, go out there and write me a fantasy story that involves A, B, and C, and it comes back, it didn't really write it. It just went out and stole from someone else and brought it into you. So I think there's got to be some level of not legislation, but there's got to be some either like a standard that our marketplace adheres to that says it cannot be this, or if you're going to use it, it must stay within these guardrails. I think at that point it would be fine. But right now it's just too much of a cluster and too nascent. And I think people are scared of it because that's exactly what it is. It's just stealing something else, somebody else's work.
yeah. I'd like to see at least a labeling law. I mean, if something's produced, it should at least be labeled as such. I still believe it's 70% hype and 30% real, but that's my own opinion. So,
yeah, I mean, it's not there yet, but it's getting there quick. And someone's going to they got to get a handle around it in the same way they did not with social media. And social media is now, it's just not good. And they've got to, I don't want to say regulate that, but there's got to be some policies or at least some standards for it in the same way there's got to be standards for the use of AI.
All right, man. Well, again, I was just about to wrap up before I threw that question at you, but
no worries at all. Thank you very much for having me. This was a lot of fun.
You can't hang on to yourself. You don't have to try not to hang on to yourself. It can't be done, and that is salvation. The most important thing for anyone to realize is that you and every person you see will soon be dead.